Sarah Coleman, a former K-9 officer confined to a wheelchair, rolled slowly through the frosted doors of Snow Haven Animal Shelter. She wasn't searching for comfort, only for a reason to quiet the long winters that had swallowed her home in silence. But when she reached the final cage at the end of the dim corridor, her breath caught. Curled in the shadows lay a German shepherd, its coat patchy, its body marked by old scars. When it lifted its head, just slightly, she froze. The eyes, deep amber, weary yet alert, were unmistakable. It was Rex, her loyal K-9 partner, the one who had vanished 3 years ago in the explosion that ended her career. How had Rex survived all this time? And why had fate led them both, broken, forgotten, to the same frozen shelter on this bitter winter morning? What happened next would melt even the coldest heart and make you believe in second chances again. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Winter pressed down on the town of Ridgefield, Montana, like a silent weight. The pines bowed under fresh snow, and the wind that swept through the valley carried the smell of frost and pine resin. The world seemed frozen in quiet grief, much like Sarah Coleman herself. Sarah was 38, tall and slender, with the posture of someone who had once commanded both respect and danger. Her face still carried the sharpness of youth, softened only by time and sorrow. Her hair, once a proud auburn, now fell to her shoulders in uneven layers streaked with silver. Her eyes were a pale gray blue, distant and watchful, like frozen lakes that had seen too much reflection. A long beige coat draped over her frame, and the blanket across her legs could not disguise the truth. She hadn't walked in 3 years. She had been one of Ridgefield's finest, calm, methodical, and fiercely loyal to her K-9 partner, Rex. But one winter night, during a raid on an abandoned cabin suspected of housing a drug ring, everything went wrong. The explosion came from nowhere. Walls fell, flames swallowed the night. When Sarah woke in the hospital, her legs were gone, and so was Rex. They told her he had likely died in the blast. She buried the badge, the uniform, and the part of herself that believed in purpose. Now she lived alone in a small wooden cabin at the edge of town. The walls carried faint scars of old photographs, frames turned face down. Each night, the wind howled through the forest behind her house, and in its lonely rhythm, she sometimes thought she heard a bark echoing through the dark. On this particular morning, the snow came down heavier than usual, falling in thick, slow flakes that blurred the horizon. Sarah wheeled herself toward the truck that had been fitted for her condition, a dull blue pickup with rust along its fenders. She didn't expect much from this trip. Her therapist had suggested that maybe adopting a dog could ease the silence. Sarah had smiled politely then, but deep down, she no longer believed silence could be softened. The Snow Haven Animal Shelter sat on the outskirts of town, a low brick building with a faded sign and steam rising from its vents. Inside, the smell of disinfectant mingled with the faint musk of wet fur. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Behind the front desk stood Linda Walker, the shelter manager, a woman in her early 50s with warm hazel eyes and a round face weathered by kindness. She wore a knitted gray sweater with a few loose threads and moved with the calm patience of someone who had spent a lifetime around frightened animals. "Officer Coleman," she greeted softly. "It's good to see you out again." Sarah managed a small nod, her gloved hands tightening on the rims of her wheelchair. "Just Sarah now," she said quietly. Her voice had a rasp that hinted at long hours of disuse. "Of course, Linda smiled. We've got a few souls who could use a friend. Take your time. Sarah followed her through narrow corridors lined with kennels. Dogs barked, tails thumped, claws scraped metal. Yet to her it was all a distant noise, muffled by the thick glass of memory. She passed by golden retrievers, terriers, and mutts of all sizes. None stirred her. She had seen too many eager faces fade into loneliness before. But when they reached the final row, Linda hesitated. He's different, she said softly. Came in a few months ago. We don't know his name. Doesn't eat much. Barely moves. In the farthest corner, half hidden in shadow, lay a German shepherd. His coat was rough and patchy, streaked with gray. His ears were torn, one slightly bent at the tip. Scars crossed his flank like pale rivers over dark fur. His body trembled faintly, but his eyes, deep amber, tired but aware, watched her with cautious stillness. Sarah's heart tightened. The years fell away. She leaned forward, breath catching. Rex? She whispered. The shepherd's ears twitched, uncertain. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. Her hands trembled on the wheels. Sit, she said, her voice breaking on the single word. For a long, unbearable second, nothing happened. Then, with a stiff, deliberate motion, the dog lowered his haunches to the cold, concrete floor, just as he had done hundreds of times before. The world stilled. The barking around them faded into a dull hum. Sarah pressed a shaking hand to her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. Linda turned, speechless, as the shepherd rose unsteadily to his feet and pressed his muzzle to the bars, eyes locked on Sarah as if no time had passed at all. The shelter lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that danced like old ghosts. Sarah reached out, fingers brushing cold metal. You came back, she whispered, voice trembling with disbelief. You found me. And as the wind howled outside, carrying snow across the frozen plains of Ridgefield, the silence that had haunted her for years finally broke, shattered by a single hoarse bark that echoed like a heartbeat returning to life. Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals, softening the world into shades of white and quiet gray. The road back to Sarah's cabin was narrow, lined with bare aspens whose branches clattered softly in the wind. Her small truck groaned against the incline as she guided it carefully through the frozen turns. In the passenger seat, Rex, the German shepherd she had thought lost forever, sat upright despite his age, his amber eyes tracking every movement outside. His fur, once sleek black and tan, had dulled into a mix of silver and brown, his muzzle dusted in gray. Scars traced faint paths along his shoulder, reminders of the explosion that had changed both their lives. Every breath he drew came slow, but there was awareness in his gaze, a soldier who had survived when he shouldn't have. When Sarah reached home, the cabin stood still among the snowdrifts like something carved from the landscape itself. A soft orange light flickered from within, glowing against the storm. Inside, warmth wrapped around her as the crackle of fire welcomed them both. The walls were wooden and scarred with time. An old police commendation hung crooked near the mantel, and beside it, a framed photo of her younger self in uniform with Rex at her side, before the blast, before the silence. She guided her wheelchair over the wooden floor, watching Rex limp uncertainly across the rug. His tail wagged once, hesitant, as though unsure he was truly allowed to be here again. Home, she said softly. Her voice carried a tremor that she quickly swallowed. The word felt fragile, almost foreign. Rex circled once and lay near the fire, his body stretching out with a tired sigh. Across the narrow road lived Tom Miller, her neighbor. Tom was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and tall, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of long years outdoors. A Marine veteran who had lost his wife to illness 2 winters ago, he carried his grief quietly, behind a trimmed beard flecked with gray, and eyes that rarely smiled but never judged. He lived with his 10-year-old son Eli, a thin, wide-eyed boy with unruly brown hair and the kind of innocence that refused to be dulled by the cold. Eli was curious by nature, always building snow forts or sketching little animals in the frost that clung to his window. That afternoon, as the wind eased and dusk fell blue over the snow, Eli spotted movement near Sarah's porch. The boy pressed his face to the window and saw the large dog resting near her steps. His breath fogged the glass. "Dad, there's a wolf outside," he said, half whispering. Tom glanced over, setting down the mug in his hand. "Not a wolf, son," he said, his deep voice calm. "That's a shepherd. Belongs to Officer Coleman." Later, when the storm quieted, Eli bundled himself in a red coat too big for his small frame and trudged across the road, leaving little footprints behind. Sarah had just finished setting Rex's water bowl when the knock came. She turned, wheels creaking against the floor, and opened the door to a gust of snow and the shy face of the boy. "Hi," he said, voice trembling with both cold and excitement. "He's beautiful. Can I pet him?" Sarah hesitated. Her eyes, sharp gray-blue, softened at the boy's earnestness. "He's still adjusting," she warned, but Eli had already crouched low, his mittened hand extended patiently. Rex, who had tensed at the sight of the stranger, lowered his head. For a few seconds, the air seemed to hold its breath. Then the old dog stepped forward, sniffed the boy's glove, and pressed his muzzle gently into the small hand. Eli laughed, a clear sound that seemed to brighten the dim room. Sarah caught herself smiling, though her chest ached with the strange warmth of it. "He likes you," she said quietly. "His name's Rex." The boy nodded solemnly, as though the introduction were sacred. "I'm Eli," he replied, and sat on the porch beside the dog, who had already relaxed enough to lean his head against the boy's knee. From across the road, Tom watched through his window. The sight of his son laughing again tugged something in him loose, a thread of grief slowly unraveling into relief. He thought about walking over to thank Sarah, but decided against it. She was private, and he understood solitude all too well. That night, the cabin glowed in the firelight. Snow drifted past the windows, whispering against the glass. Sarah sat near the hearth, the warmth touching her pale skin, the shadows soft against her cheekbones. Her auburn hair, slightly tangled from the wind, glimmered in the fire's reflection. Rex slept by her chair, paws twitching faintly as though chasing ghosts in dreams. She picked up the small silver whistle that once hung from her uniform, a tool that had once meant control, teamwork, trust. Her fingers traced its edge before she blew softly. The sound was thin, almost uncertain. Rex stirred, his ears twitching, and he looked at her with cautious recognition. "Sit," she said, her tone steady. The shepherd obeyed immediately. Sarah exhaled shakily, a small smile ghosting her lips. But then, as she reached for the next command, a sudden bang echoed from outside. The back door had slammed in the wind. Rex flinched violently, dropping to the floor, tail tucked, a whine breaking from his chest. His breathing quickened, eyes wild, as if the explosion had returned. Sarah froze, her heart twisted at the sight. She set the whistle down slowly, rolling closer until her hand reached his fur. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's over. You're safe now." Rex trembled beneath her touch, then slowly pressed his head against her knee, his breaths easing with each passing second. The fire crackled softly. The world outside howled, but inside there was only the fragile quiet of two broken beings learning how to trust the warmth again. Sarah looked down at Rex and saw her own reflection in his eyes, wounded, weary, but still alive. In that moment, she understood. Neither of them had truly come home yet, but they had begun the journey back. The night came howling through Ridgefield like a wounded beast. Snow whipped sideways across the streets, and the wind screamed through the trees that lined Maple Hill. Inside her small cabin, Sarah Coleman, a 38-year-old former K-9 officer confined to a wheelchair, sat near the dim glow of the fireplace. Her skin, pale under the flickering light, gleamed with a sheen of sweat. The years had stripped her of strength, but not of dignity. Her auburn hair, now threaded with gray, clung damply to her temples. Every breath came ragged and shallow, the ache in her chest a cruel reminder of the explosion that had ended her career and nearly her life. The scar tissue in her lungs, born of smoke and fire, had grown more merciless each winter. Outside, the storm raged. Wind clawed at the windows, rattling the panes like bones. Power lines sagged under ice. The lights flickered once, twice, then surrendered, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only glow came from the faint embers in the hearth, casting trembling shadows across the room. Sarah's hand fumbled for the oxygen tank at her side, a small silver cylinder almost empty. Her fingers, pale and trembling, twisted the valve, and she pressed the mask against her lips. Nothing. A weak hiss sputtered, then silence. Panic coiled tight in her chest. Her wheelchair creaked as she tried to reach for the phone, but when she pressed the button, there was no signal. Only the wind's merciless voice filled the room. She whispered to herself, "Stay calm, Coleman. Stay calm." Though her pulse raced. Each inhale was a battle, each exhale a small surrender. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, trying to believe she could ride this one out like all the others. But this storm was different. It felt alive, vengeful. Across the room, Rex, her 9-year-old German shepherd, lifted his head. His fur shimmered gold and sable even in the dim light, though the scars across his flank glistened faintly like white rivers. His ears twitched, catching the faint wheeze of her breath. The dog rose slowly, his limbs stiff with age and old pain, and padded toward her. He whined once, low and uncertain. Sarah met his amber eyes and tried to smile, though her lips had gone blue. "I'm okay," she rasped. But Rex knew better. The scent of fear and struggle filled the air. He pressed his muzzle to her knee, then turned sharply toward the door, nostrils flaring at the cold seeping through its cracks. The next gust of wind hit the cabin so hard the walls groaned. Snow burst through the frame, scattering fine white dust across the wooden floor. Sarah's vision blurred. Her head swam. She tried to call Rex's name again, but her voice came out as a whisper. The dog barked sharply, 1, 2, 3 times, a signal, a decision, and then he was gone. He lunged at the door, pushing it open with his weight. The cold rushed in, fierce and punishing, but Rex didn't hesitate. He charged into the storm, disappearing into the blinding white. Across the road, the Miller house stood in the half-dark, its roof heavy with snow. Eli Miller, a 10-year-old boy with messy brown hair and eyes too curious for his own safety, sat by the window, watching the wind bend the trees. He loved storms, their noise, their wildness, but something about this one made his stomach twist. When he saw a shape moving through the blizzard, a large, dark dog forcing its way through the drifts, he jumped up. "Dad!" he shouted. Tom Miller, a tall man in his mid-40s with the build of a Marine and the silence of a man who'd seen too much, rose from the couch. His face was all angles, strong jaw, deep lines carved by loss, eyes the color of winter ash. Since his wife's death 2 years earlier, he'd become a man of few words but unshakable instincts. He stepped to the window, squinting through the blur of snow. When he saw Rex, soaked and desperate, barking toward Sarah's cabin, the truth struck instantly. "Something's wrong," he muttered. Tom pulled on his heavy coat and boots, his movements swift, precise, the rhythm of training never forgotten. "Stay close, Eli," he ordered, voice firm but calm. The boy grabbed a flashlight and followed his father into the chaos. The cold slammed into them like a wall. The beam of light wavered across the whiteness until it caught Rex, barking and circling, then bolting back toward Sarah's cabin. "Go!" Tom shouted, pushing forward through snow up to his knees. By the time they reached the cabin, the door hung open, swaying on its hinges. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke from the dying fire. Sarah lay slumped beside her wheelchair, her hand limp near the fallen oxygen mask. Her skin was as pale as the snow outside. Rex stood over her, drenched, trembling, his chest heaving from exertion, but refusing to move away. Tom dropped to his knees beside her, checking for a pulse. "She's breathing," he said, voice sharp with urgency. "Barely." He looked up at Eli, whose face was wide with fear. "Call 911, now!" The boy's hands shook as he fumbled with the phone, the line crackling but mercifully alive. Tom lifted Sarah's shoulders slightly, trying to keep her airway open, his own heart pounding in rhythm with the wind that screamed against the walls. When the flashing red lights of the ambulance finally cut through the storm, Rex let out a single bark, then collapsed beside her, eyes half closed, his body curling protectively near her wheelchair. Paramedics rushed in, their shouts mingling with the roar of the storm. But through it all, the dog didn't move, not until they lifted Sarah onto the stretcher. Only then did he rise, limping after her as though afraid the world would take her away again. By dawn, when the blizzard had quieted and light returned to Ridgefield, word had already spread through the town. The K-9 who braved the storm to save his handler. In the silence that followed, as smoke rose from the chimneys and snow melted into slush, the people of Ridgefield spoke of the dog who had awakened a sleeping town, and of the woman who had finally been given back her life. The snow had stopped, leaving the town blanketed under a pale moonlight that shimmered across rooftops and frozen trees. Ridgefield had fallen into that fragile silence that comes after a storm, when even the wind seems afraid to disturb what's been rebuilt. Inside her small cabin, Sarah Coleman sat near the window, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her wheelchair. Her body still bore the weight of recovery. Thin wrists, a narrow frame draped in a wool sweater, and auburn hair tied loosely behind her neck. Her skin, pale and freckled from the cold, reflected the fire's orange glow. Though her wounds had healed, the shadow of doubt still lingered in her eyes. She had saved many lives as an officer, yet trusting herself again was harder than facing death. On the rug by the hearth, Rex, the old German shepherd, lay curled with his muzzle resting on his paws. His fur had thickened since the storm, though silver streaks framed his face like the marks of a soldier who had survived 1,000 winters. His eyes, amber and knowing, never drifted far from Sarah. The townsfolk called him the miracle dog now, the one who braved the storm and saved his master. Children left treats by the gate. A photo of him had even appeared on the bulletin board outside the diner. Yet to Sarah, he was still just her partner, the only being who understood the quiet ache that haunted her nights. Outside, the streets were empty. The Miller house across the road glowed faintly through drifting snow. Tom Miller, the stoic ex-Marine neighbor with a beard trimmed close to his weathered jawline, was a man built of discipline and loss. He still carried himself as if the world might test him again at any moment. Tonight, he sat by his window, polishing an old brass watch that had belonged to his late wife. Beside him, his 10-year-old son Eli, a boy of restless curiosity with messy brown hair and bright hazel eyes, worked on his homework. The pencil tapped in rhythm with the ticking clock. At Sarah's cabin, the peace shattered suddenly. Rex's head shot up, ears pricked. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Sarah looked up from her notebook, startled. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. The dog moved to the window, muscles tensing. Outside, under the dim porch light, a shadow slipped between the houses, slow, deliberate, too heavy for the wind. Sarah's pulse quickened. She wheeled closer, her fingers tightening on the frame. Through the blur of snow, she saw movement, someone creeping along the Miller property, near the tool shed. Rex barked sharply, the sound slicing through the still night. "Rex, wait!" Sarah called, but he was already in motion. The shepherd lunged through the door she had barely unlatched, his powerful form vanishing into the cold. Panic and instinct collided inside her chest. She reached for the phone with trembling hands and dialed the local police line. "This is Sarah Coleman. There's someone outside, near Maple and Cedar. My dog's pursuing him." Her voice was firm despite the fear clawing at her throat. Moments later, the thief, a man in his 30s with a gaunt face hidden under a torn gray hood, stumbled through the snow behind the Miller house. His movements were jerky, desperate, the kind of man who'd been running from more than one kind of trouble. He turned at the sound of barking, just in time to see Rex bounding toward him, a streak of black and gold against white. The man cursed, tripped over a drift, and scrambled toward the street, but Rex cut him off, snarling, holding the line without attacking, a trained guardian, not a killer. The sound of sirens grew in the distance, faint at first, then closer. Officer Ryan Carter, a young patrolman of 27 with sandy hair and a square jaw dusted with winter stubble, steered his cruiser up the icy slope. Ryan was known for his quick reflexes and quiet respect for the veterans who came before him. Tonight, he wore his navy jacket zipped high against the cold, his breath visible as he stepped from the car. "Ridgefield Police!" he shouted. "Hands where I can see them!" The suspect froze, his chest heaving, snow clinging to his clothes. Ryan moved swiftly, hand on his holster, while Rex stood guard, eyes locked and unyielding. From her porch, Sarah watched the red and blue lights paint the snow. Her hands trembled, but her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in years: certainty. When Ryan approached her after cuffing the suspect, his tone carried admiration. "Your dog's still got it, ma'am," he said, smiling faintly. Sarah looked down at Rex, who now sat obediently by her chair, tail thumping once against the wood. "We both needed something to prove," she replied softly. By morning, Ridgefield was buzzing again. News traveled fast in small towns, especially good news. At the local elementary school, Eli sat at his desk, chewing on his pencil as his teacher announced the week's writing topic. Write about your hero. Most kids picked firemen, soldiers, or their parents, but Eli wrote without pause. His paper began with 4 simple words. My hero walks on 4 legs. In his essay, he described the night Rex had saved his neighbor, the storm that had nearly taken her, and now how the same dog had caught a thief. He wrote of bravery that didn't need words, of loyalty that didn't fade with time. When his teacher read it aloud, the classroom fell silent. By the next day, the story was printed in the Ridgefield Gazette under the headline, Boy's Essay Honors the Town's Canine Hero. That evening, Sarah sat by the fire again, reading the article aloud to Rex. You hear that? She murmured, scratching behind his ear. They're calling you the Night Guardian now. Rex looked up at her, tail swishing lazily, and for a brief, perfect moment she laughed, a sound light enough to melt even the coldest night in Ridgefield. The last snow of winter drifted lazily through the air, catching the morning sun like scattered glass. The town of Ridgefield breathed again after months of cold, its streets wet with meltwater, the smell of pine and thawing earth rising in the air. Inside the familiar wooden cabin near Maple Hill, Sarah Coleman, now 38, sat by the open window, her hands resting on the rim of her wheelchair. Her once frail frame had regained quiet strength. The pale skin of her face now held a touch of color, and her auburn hair, tied back in a neat braid streaked faintly with gray, framed the determined calm in her gray-blue eyes. She was no longer the hollow woman who had once rolled through life as if in penance. She had learned, slowly, to let warmth back in. Near the hearth, Rex, her loyal German shepherd, lay sprawled across the rug. Age had softened his movements, but not his spirit. His coat, once dark and sleek, had faded to a dignified silver brown. A faint scar still traced the length of his flank, a mark of service and survival. Though his breathing was slower now, there was still that spark, the alertness of a protector who never truly rests. Sarah reached down and brushed her hand through his fur, her fingers tracing the coarse strands. You've earned some rest, partner, she murmured. The dog opened one eye, as if amused, before closing it again. Life in Ridgefield had changed since the storm. The cabin no longer stood alone in silence. Across the road, Tom Miller, the rugged ex-Marine with a soldier's build and a kind but weary heart, had rebuilt part of his fence, this time making it taller and sturdier. The years of loss still showed in his rough hands and quiet gaze, yet there was a gentleness now, something softened by laughter, something healed by time. His son, Eli Miller, had grown taller, his brown hair constantly tousled by the wind and his cheeks flushed from long days outside. The boy spent his afternoons at Sarah's place, helping train dogs with a seriousness far beyond his 10 years. At the center of it all stood Linda Walker, the shelter manager in her 50s, her hazel eyes shining with pride behind her glasses. She had been the one who planted the idea that became something greater, a place of second chances. Together, she and Sarah founded the program Second Paws, a modest but growing initiative to train wounded or abandoned dogs to trust humans again. The old barn behind the shelter had been repaired, its roof mended, its walls now echoing with the sound of barking and laughter. On this morning, the yard buzzed with life. Dogs of all shapes and scars roamed freely, some limping, some missing patches of fur, others timid but curious. In their midst, Rex walked slowly, his gait steady but proud. The other dogs watched him, following his lead. When Sarah gave the command, "Sit," Rex obeyed first, lowering himself with deliberate grace, and one by one the others mirrored him. Linda, standing nearby in her worn denim jacket, smiled. "Still teaching the recruits," she said warmly. "He's got more patience than I do." Sarah chuckled. "He always did." Eli ran past, his red scarf trailing, tossing a ball to one of the younger dogs, a spotted mix named Daisy, who still flinched at loud noises. "Good girl," he called, laughing as she dropped the ball at his feet. Watching him, Sarah felt something in her chest loosen, a quiet peace she hadn't known since before the explosion. Tom was repairing the new wooden fence, his sleeves rolled up, sawdust clinging to his forearms. He looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze across the yard, and offered a nod that said everything words didn't need to. That afternoon, the town gathered for a small ceremony at the shelter. Folding chairs dotted the snowy ground, and a simple banner hung across the gate, "Honoring our companion of honor." The mayor, a stout man with a friendly mustache and a deep laugh, held a small box in his hands. The crowd fell silent as Sarah wheeled herself forward, Rex trotting loyally beside her. The mayor opened the box, revealing a medal of polished bronze engraved with the words, "For courage, loyalty, and light." He knelt to fasten it around Rex's neck. The old shepherd stood tall, the medal gleaming against his fur, eyes bright in the late winter light. Applause rippled through the crowd, mingled with laughter and quiet tears. Eli was the first to step forward, wrapping his arms around Rex's neck. "You're the best hero there is," he whispered, his small voice breaking just enough to draw smiles all around. Linda clapped her hands, calling out, "To Rex, the one who reminds us that loyalty never grows old." The cheer that followed rolled through the yard like music. When the people had gone, the snow began to fall again, light, slow, as if reluctant to leave. Sarah sat by the fire that evening, the metal glinting softly on Rex's chest. He rested his head on her knee, eyes half closed. "You saved me twice," she said softly, her voice trembling with affection. "The first time from death, and the second from forgetting how to live." Her words hung in the air, fragile but true. Outside, the final flakes of the season landed gently on the frozen earth, each one catching the faint orange glow from the cabin's window. Rex stirred, lifting his head to look at her. His amber eyes caught the light, reflecting not just the fire but something deeper, trust, memory, and the quiet knowing that his purpose had been fulfilled. The fire crackled, the storm long gone, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt completely at peace. The world outside was still cold, but inside, everything was warm again. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or blinding light. They arrive quietly, on 4 tired paws, with snow clinging to their fur and love still burning in their eyes. In Ridgefield, 1 woman and 1 dog found each other again, not because fate owed them anything, but because grace never stops looking for the lost. Rex didn't just return to Sarah. He reminded her that even in our darkest winters, God's hand is still at work, stitching broken souls back together in ways we may never understand. Maybe that's how miracles truly happen, not in grand moments, but in small acts of loyalty, forgiveness, and faith that refuse to die. And perhaps tonight, as you listen to this story, there's something in your life waiting to heal too. A person, a memory, a wound long carried in silence. Believe that God still moves through the quiet corners of our days, through kindness, through second chances, through love that stays. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never gone. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what miracle you still believe in. And if you believe that God still sends his angels, sometimes with fur, sometimes with scars, but always with love, then tap subscribe and join us for more stories where faith and compassion still light the way. May God bless you and your family with warmth, strength, and a light that never fades, no matter how cold the world may seem.